London, and I stayed there till 2004, where I moved up to Kendal, and I carried on working in the radical book trade, present and second-hand dealer. So I've been in the second-hand book trade since 1975, and I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up.
Right, and I'm Maggie Walker. So there were four of us who have been working on this project for 5 years. I worked at a shop called Grassroots Books in Manchester, where, as John's mentioned, Rick also worked. It was the largest radical bookshop outside London for much of that time, and it was run as a worker cooperative. I was there from 76 to 82. The shop itself ran from 71 to 1990. So that starts us off as to who we are. What we've prepared a script running through, telling you something about the work we've been doing and the radical bookselling that we understand, are getting to understand. We understand it from our personal experience, and we're collecting it as a history. So first, what is radical bookselling? So from our personal experience at shops in different towns in 70s and 80s, and from our work over the last 5 years, where we've been collecting oral histories from people who survived that movement, and many have moved on to other things. And we've had written accounts from people as well who were involved. The description radical bookshop is a broad one. There was a lot of variety actually among these shops, as you would imagine. Most provided, of course, books. Pamphlets were very important, magazines too. And there was other material, posters, badges, cards, and records, even, LPs. And they related to the many and overlapping progressive and alternative movements of the 70s, 80s, 90s. There's a quote from an article that I was involved in that's in Northwest Labour History Journal. It said radical bookshops stock included feminist, gay and lesbian publications, books by Black and African writers, Marxist and Maoist texts, books on broader socialist themes, anarchism, peace and anti-racism, what was then, of course, known as third world politics, we know it differently now, and their history, Eastern philosophies, hallucinogenic experiences and homeopathy, and even vegetarianism was radical at the time. But a shop focusing on those latter topics would have probably used the description of being an alternative bookshop as opposed to a radical bookshop. The nomenclature changed over the period. In our view, radical bookselling was more than running a bookshop. It was also about being a hub for many of the radical movements of the time, by selling badges, tickets for coaches to demonstrations, hosting notice boards that allowed radicals to meet up, find house shares, advertise a new women's liberation consciousness raising group or a political meeting. Many bookshops provided radical groups with a place to use as an address, protecting individual households from sharing their personal address. And of course, because of course there was the potential that they could become a target of the right-wing hooligans from the National Front. Many shops had areas for children's books, carefully curating the books available to the philosophy of that shop. Some of the shops had enough space to provide a meeting venue for small groups, sometimes in the shop itself, surrounded by books, or in larger shops. There were separate, maybe a separate room at the back or upstairs. Some of the shops had a cafe. The entire ground floor of Wedge in Coventry, where John worked, was a cafe with the bookshop upstairs. And some shops were part of larger projects, particularly those known as community bookshops in areas of London, such as Centerprise or the Tower Hamlets Arts Project. Some shops shared space with a Whole Food shop, and that was in the days when Whole Food shops stocked the brown flour and pulses and beans that were unavailable elsewhere. There were also other specialist shops. Gaze the Word in London, Lavender Menace in Edinburgh, Sister Right, the feminist shop in Islington, Freedom, an anarchist shop, and there were black bookshops such as New Beacon and Bogle Louverture, and they were also publishers, very much serving the black movement. And there were many more. I can see Jane's here. So Silver Moon, of course, was one of those in the later years of the period we're looking at. Most of the bookshops ran bookstores as well, taking their stock out to their audiences at local and even national events. Although you're all involved in thinking about bookselling, we wanted to talk a bit about what was involved. We found and knew what was involved in the radical bookselling of the time. Most of the people involved in these bookshops had no experience in the book trade or in business. It was a steep learning curve. And as you'll know, bookselling at that time was very labor intensive. Booksellers in our archives describe sending off more than 50 orders a week by post, and time spent in sympathetic bookshops writing onto cards the details of the books that they would want to stock. And of course, we used index cards as our stock control method. Lynn Alderson, who was one of the founders in 1978 of Sister Right, the unique feminist bookshop in Islington, wrote, "Many of the publications we wanted to stock were from the USA. We spent some of our capital sending me to the US to set up accounts with publishers and with a distributor, and to set up an American bank account so that we could pay directly in dollars. Woman Books of New York were generous and sisterly and allowed me to spend 3 days standing on stools, going through their shelves and writing index cards with information about all their books." So, quite time and labor intensive. There were, of course, in the 70s, physical volumes of books in print, which became available on microfiche, but these weren't a sufficient resource and were often too expensive for these small shops. The process of ordering this stock involved handwriting out the order in a duplicate or triplicate book, and in the case of US imports, waiting a couple of months for the shipment to arrive. While that labor-intensive ordering process would have been the same for other bookshops, the focus in the radical shops on stocking material that was otherwise difficult to get hold of made it more intensive. We might be writing out orders for 5 pamphlets from one socialist organization. In addition, importing wasn't always plain sailing. Parcels of books were intercepted by customs officers. Several booksellers who contributed to our oral history archive report on stock that was damaged in that process. And you may know the manager and directors of the specialist gay bookshop, Gaze the Word, were raided by police and faced a possible prison sentence when prosecuted under outdated obscenity laws for some of their imports. So thinking about how many shops there were, Dave, who's here with us, has a historical listing of the radical bookshops available on his website. And we've looked at the Radical Bookseller, which again, we'll talk about later. In a 1980 edition, there were listed 100 radical shops in the UK. And in the 1992 directory of radical bookselling, 103 shops. But we also found that less than half were actually members of the relevant federation, whatever it was called at the time, of radical bookshops. In 1982, they listed 44 member shops, and in 1987, 34. Dave will be talking more about these federations. A very few of these shops have survived from the 1970s to today. News from Nowhere in Liverpool, which is still collectively run, celebrates 50 years of trading this year. They attribute this longevity to having bought their premises using donations from supporters and sympathetic loans, at the end of the 1980s. Many other shops closed in the 1990s due to the change in the political and broader economic climate, pressures of increased rents, the end of the net book agreement, and changes in bookselling. The mainstream shops broadened their stock, including feminist and gay titles, and chains such as Waterstones added to the pressures on all independent shops. And then just talk a little bit about what we know about the financing of the shops. We haven't got much information, but it's undeniable that these shops were often undercapitalized and survived on what could be called the sweat equity of their workers, i.e. free or underpriced labor. Our oral histories include descriptions of wage rates pegged to the level of the dole, i.e. unemployment benefit, and even of working with no wages while claiming the dole. And some were run deliberately by volunteers or with one manager and a group of volunteers around them. There is some evidence of appeals for donations. As already mentioned, this helped News from Nowhere buy their premises. And there's also committed people providing loans or capitals for shops. Some shops made the case for a grant from the local arts council and were successful. Some used government employment schemes to help pay salary costs. In our oral histories, we have shops that sold cards, which had a better margin, student textbooks well outside their normal stock parameters, with support from sympathetic lecturers sending students to those shops. And but also things like stretching credit to the point of being on stop, at least until you needed to order the Christmas stock in. And one that Grassroots managed to do, and some others, obtaining contracts to supply libraries, which was a way of helping the financial position. The dependence on Christmas sales was the same for many radical shops as for other bookshops. Unfortunately, very few financial records have survived. We haven't yet investigated whether there may be some limited information in the National Archives for those shops that were formally registered, such as those that were registered as worker cooperatives and had to submit annual accounts to government. But we haven't looked into that yet. They're not online. And of course, Jane's book that you were talking about at your last session is valuable in having had access to the financial records of Silver Moon. I found that fascinating. And do know that the records of Lavender Menace from Edinburgh are held in Edinburgh City's archives. So at this point, I'll hand over to John.
Right, you've got me for the next bit, talking about some of the aspect of the ownership and structure and ways of working, and a bit more about the political and social context of all this. So some shops were private businesses owned and run by one or two individuals. Some belonged to political parties, but the largest category was those with a cooperative structure, either a worker co-op owned by its workers or owned by the local community as a community co-op. We can't confidently yet analyse the proportion falling into each category, but as an example, in 1987 there was a meeting which stated that 17 of the 34 shops in attendance were a co-op or collective, 3 were non-co-op collective, unfortunately no information on the remaining 14. So for example, Sister Right and Grassroots, we've already heard about, were registered as co-ops, ran as collectives, with their own challenges. So the article on Grassroots Books describes some of those challenges, where the shop had no manager, and in theory at least, the tasks were shared out and issues discussed at weekly or possibly more frequent staff meetings. Jane, we're going to quote from you here. In a collective, all workers should be equally involved in policy and decision making, ranging from who's going to make the tea to whether to buy a new shop and everything in between. Most collectives have regular meetings to discuss issues, usually once a week, and at those meetings the members try and reach consensus before taking a decision. End of quote. There were a few shops with a longer history, particularly those affiliated to political parties such as the Communist Party, notably Collett's and Central Books in London, as part of that party's efforts to take its left-wing message to the people. A history of Central Books, written by Dave here, who's with us, for its 60th anniversary in 1999, recounts its history as a shop and as a distributor. And Central distribution continues to this day. And then the Socialist Workers' Party, for example, then known as the International Socialists, had a bookshop known as Bookmarks in London, also still going, which, to quote Dave, quote, played a key role in organising the annual Socialist Book Fair, which became a splendid non-sectarian event that had to be taken seriously by the whole book trade. Practically all the major academic publishers were represented with stalls, end of quote. So just to say a bit more about the times, the 1970s and the context, and I've termed this a ripple from the 1960s, which in turn was a ripple from the expansion of higher education following the Robbins report. It's interesting, I did a bit of research. The number of students doubled, higher education students doubled every decade from the 60s to the 90s, from 100,000 in 1960 to 1 million by the end of by the early 90s. And many of the radical shops were in or near university towns. Many of the workers were graduates. Many of the customers were HE students. We can't put figures to that yet. And as Maggie's already said, many of the shops augmented their sales of radical literature with sales of student textbooks, helped by sympathetic lecturers. Most of the founders as graduates were young, shall we say in their 20s. And this is something we discussed. We think that over time it also became more gender balanced as the sexual politics of the time played out within these collectives. And for these people, joining or setting up a radical bookshop was itself a political act, as well as a way of earning a not very good living. And it was a way of achieving a degree of personal freedom and autonomy not available in traditional employment. And in fact, it might well have entailed leaving or not applying for employment that would have been better paid and had better working conditions, although probably wouldn't have been nearly so much fun. And today, the modish and rather pallid term for this kind of business is social enterprise, but we think the term political enterprise is a bit of better fit for the kinds of enterprises, bookshops that we're talking about. And interestingly, again, sort of anecdotal, many of these workers who were then in their 20s went on to interesting later working lives outside the book trade, and often with a strong political flavour. We have at least two who became cabinet ministers, one in the Labour UK government and one in the Welsh government. We have one I used to work with, who's now leader of a Labour council in the north of England. And interestingly, one of the founders of Agitprop became chief of the New York office of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. I can give you the names later if you're interested. These are all hypotheses about the nature of the workforce and what happened to them, and we will be looking into this in a bit more detail. And of course, we're a bit short of time, so I won't go on about this, but we should just remind ourselves, I think, that the 1970s, which is the time when this movement exploded really in its scale, was an incredibly turbulent political and social period. Just for example, the two minor strikes of 72 and 74, the first National Women's Liberation Conference held in Oxford in 1970. We had the 3-day week. We had 4 general elections. We had how many changes of Prime Minister? Almost as many as the recent Tory government. We had Bloody Sunday in Derry in 1972. We had a number of high-profile trials in the early 70s, such as the Angry Brigade, the Little Red School Book, and the Oz trials, which were all in 1971-72. And part of that was an upsurge in interest in democratic ownership and control by workers and communities, and which fitted with the organisational structure of many of the shops. The lack of hierarchy, the job rotation, the skill sharing, that we've already heard about. And there was also, we thought when preparing this talk, it was interesting to point out that there was a kind of new politics of literacy around at the time. The growth of the worker, writer and community publishing movement, for example. And some of the shops, in fact, had links with that community publishing movement, where groups met in the shop, groups of local residents, and wrote, and the shops published what they'd written. That's something that we will be exploring a bit more. Just to say that we've already talked a bit about the decline of the movement through the competition and what was happening in the marketplace, but also as the shops became more established, it was very hard work physically, long hours, modest pay, and as these youngsters grew older, they acquired more responsibilities, children, mortgages. They became a little burnout was a phrase that was used at the time, tired, and it was also quite hard to find recruits with the same level of commitment. And so we think that sort of those patterns and phenomena amongst the workforce also were a contributory factor to the decline in the movement. Just to say a bit more before I pass on to Dave about the function of the shops as community hubs, which Maggie's already referred to, that they sold a whole range of activities and played a crucial role in supporting local activist network in what we have to remind ourselves were very much pre-internet times. Printed material was the primary mode of broadcast communications. It was all about personal contact, and Radical Bookshops provided the perfect location. It's a place where local activists from all sorts of groups and campaigns could meet each other either in a planned way or serendipitously, especially if there were those meeting rooms on the premises that we've already heard about, or a cafe and so on. Everybody bumped into each other. And then there were the walls, there were the notice boards peppered with posters, announcements, petitions, requests for help, requests for money, flat share we've already heard about, and so on. If there was a demo called at short notice, stick a poster in the shop window. And yeah, so that really makes them, you know, much more than their commercial function of bookselling, elements of these local radical networks, and memorable to people of today looking back at their radical pasts. People often bump into the streets who will remember the Wedge, which closed in 1997, and they'll still talk about it with great affection and fondness, and as vivid memories. Over to Dave.
Dave, you're on mute still. Sorry.
Sorry. I'm going to make a few comments about the organisations of the radical book trade, and then talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done. The radical book trade had a membership organisation. It was initially called the Federation of Alternative Bookshops, and that was only open to collectively run and non-party bookshops. And after the 1980 Working Together conference in York, it changed the name to the Federation of Radical Booksellers and became open to all radical shops. And this lasted into the early 1990s. Today, there is the Alliance of Radical Booksellers, which came out of discussions in 2010, and I think it was founded the following year. It has 54 listed members, which includes some online businesses and some second-hand businesses, as well as 10 survivors from the earlier FRB. There was a trade journal, The Radical Bookseller, which ran to 78 issues between 1979 and 1992, which, thanks to our initiative, is being digitised by the Senate House Library at London University in conjunction with the Emil Melbourne Trust. And we hope that it won't be too long before that is available for everybody. The Radical Bookseller published 4 issues that were standalone lists of bookshops 3 issues that stand alone is just of publishers, listing of publishers, and 1 with a list of magazines, all Radical, of course. And these special issues were sold separately, otherwise it was a subscription journal. The Radical Bookseller also produced a directory in book format, which I'll show you here, in 1992, which combined all 3 of the bookshops, magazines and publishers. All these books, the FRB published 2 books as well, starting a bookshop and making connections, Radical Books Today. All these books are ISBNs showing the professional understanding of the mainstream book trade. A third feature of the FRB era, as we call it, was the series of book fairs: Socialist, Radical Black and Third World, Feminist, and Anarchist. These are covered in an article in the forthcoming issue of our newsletter, so I won't say any more about them now, except that they had some international impact, which is interesting. I'd like to say a few words about the difficulties in identifying Radical bookshops. Even with the FRB records, there are problems. Minutes of reports of conferences were very variable in quality and length. Quite a few potential shops who had contacted the FAB and which appear in their newsletters did not materialize, with some not able to find or afford premises, and some remained as mere bookstores, which played a key role in the beginning of many of the bookshops of this period. And also some shops were very, very short-lived, often in squatted premises. Maggie's mentioned the overlap with Whole Food shops, and you may think that these should not be included. But for the magazines and book publishers, for instance, those specializing in cookery, vegetarianism, farming, and green issues generally, they could be quite important, and that's why we do tend to include them. Some shops seem to have disappeared, leaving no trace, even online. But in the last week, we had an email with invaluable information about a shop called Partisan Books in Luton, very small and short-lived, but we knew very little about it, and it had information about the personnel involved. And we're very keen to name and celebrate these individuals in the listings that we produce. In my most recent foray into the FRB archives, I discovered one shop they hadn't come across in some 30 years of recording them, Grapevine in Hastings. And also this week, Googling, I found details of another, Lifespan, in a hamlet in Yorkshire, which may turn out to be a collective involved only in printing and publishing, but they did open a Whole Food shop in Huddersfield and had a role in the FRB, though they are not on any list of members. Those are some of the problems we face. Turning to our work, you have the link to the conference reports and newsletters left on the Shelves website, which is my second-hand book business, where there is also a bibliography of the Radical book trade, though this is a little bit out of date. I'll be updating that over the next few months. The reports of our newsletters and but not the conference, are also available on the Alliance of Radical Booksellers website. On the subject of bibliographies, following on from my little central books, A Brief History, I can give a plug for here, which is still in print, believe it or not. It's pretty amazing after all these years, over 25 years, still in print. Not a good sign in other ways. there have been, over the last decade, there's been 6 other books dealing with specific radical bookshops in this country. So that's a really good position we're in at the moment. There have been articles in our newsletters on the very first radical booksellers, and that's usually in the earlier issues of the newsletter. We've also covered the contemporary scene, so we're pretty broad-minded and not rigid in our interest, though we do concentrate on the FAB, FRB period. We intend to include the occasional article on foreign radical bookshops, which we haven't done yet, and perhaps British publishers. But what we would really like to see is an equivalent group looking into the history of radical publishers. We are aware that many countries had traditions of radical bookshops and still have. Scandinavia, Germany, and the USA probably had a good percentage, but it is possible Britain had the highest number, and we'd love for research to either prove us wrong or right. And I'm working on a list of foreign radical bookshops and book fairs, and these will be uploaded online at a later date when they're a bit more substantial and people can make additions to. So if anyone's got any specific knowledge of foreign radical bookshops, please get in touch, and could be great help. Our collaborative research is mentioned in the text introducing us on your website. I would just add that we've passed on to the Working Class Movement Library, who hold the archives of the FAB and FRB, copies of documents that we have in our personal collection, and this has made it an even more comprehensive collection. We're working on a list of other archives and their locations that we know of so far, and we make these available again when they're more substantial. We've been involved in the history of grassroots books in Manchester that Maggie mentioned, and this led to an article in the North West Labour History Journal and in our newsletter, and also the depositing of archive material in Manchester Library. We've also been involved in a rather depressing attempt to set up a Wikipedia page for grassroots, because Britain's biggest bookshop outside London, but without success yet. We look forward to a fruitful collaboration with the BRN. Perhaps you could come up with suggestions for a collaboration between ourselves and an academic partner. You may have connections there, people who are interested in using our energy and resources to work with their students. We hope you will sign up to receive our newsletters. We hope you'll let us know of anything you come across that might interest us in our field. And please feel free to offer us appropriate articles yourselves. On a final personal note, I'm intending to write a multi-volume history of the radical book from 1780. At the moment, I expect it to be 3.5 volumes, a half volume being the shorter book on libraries. Thank you.
All right. Did I ever heard from everybody, or Maggie or John, are you coming back, or you've done your bits?
That's our bit, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't imagine there aren't questions here. Does anyone, for questions, either you can type them into the chat and we can ask them, or if you want to raise your hand using the classic Zoom method, please do so. Yeah, Matthew?
Thank you all very much for this talk, and Dave in particular. I've benefited immensely from your research and continue to do so. So thank you. I guess the question I had. It's kind of about parameters, like how, and not so much how you define radical, but how you make choices and like what to focus on, what not to focus on. Like I mean, obviously, like a Waterstones wouldn't fit into what you're looking at, but like, where's the line for you? I mean, are there anything, if you come across anything that's like in a gray area, or something you've had to like exclude because you don't think it's quite radical enough? I'm just kind of curious how you define those boundaries.
I can start off. I mean, I don't think we have been in the position of having anything as a news for contributions to the newsletter that we weren't accepting. But Dave, you've been dealing with this for longer. Have your comments?
Well, I exclude all the new age bookshops, to be honest. I don't see them as radical, but as I mentioned, for some of the food shops, they could have been important for certain magazines and publishers, but as bookshops, I wouldn't include them. And the literary shops as well are something I don't deal with. I mean, it's very difficult because Compendium obviously had a huge radical element, but it went much wider. But you couldn't exclude that from the radical shops. But in many ways, it had similar sections to New Age or even mainstream bookshops. And I noticed College they never stocked any of the weird religions as they described them, and Eastern philosophy. They kept that out of their definition of radical books.
I suppose it's like so many things, isn't it? We're talking about a spectrum here, and it's where did you draw the edges of the spectrum? They're all different. I think the political, any shops that thought of themselves as political, but an example of one that in the grey might be Public House Bookshop in Brighton, which run by Richard Capidi, an American, which was very concerned with Native American culture and politics and specialist in that, and I don't think ever took part in the FRB or FAB. But probably if you asked the people in Brighton at that time, they'd have probably thought it was a radical bookshop. It's a debate that they'll never be you can never come to a definitive conclusion on it, I think. And I'm not sure it really matters unless you're doing quantitative work, in which case you'd probably have to impose some sort of framework, wouldn't you?
Thank you.
Have you ever done any research into Welsh medium as bookshops, as radical bookshops? Because they were actually the center for a lot of radical activity in Wales in this period. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, the Radical Bookseller did have a couple of articles in Welsh. They made a gesture toward that. I think when I get round to writing about magazines, because when I talk about the radical book, I include radical magazines because they were so crucial to radical movements. They were identified through them and sometimes by their names. In the 19th century and early 20th century, the Welsh publishing industry was very interesting, in a radical sense. So I will be looking into that.
We have a question from Jolie Braun. Says that politics was already discussed, but any of these bookstores from the 70s and 80s that are still in existence, some of the examples that you can come up with.
Well, I mentioned in the talk that in Liverpool there's one called News from Nowhere that was started in the 1970s and is still there, and if you're in that area, do support it. Houseman's is another that's in London, and they've survived right the way through this period. And from the list that Dave was working on, we've identified 10 in total, but I don't know if you've got the names of the others, Dave, or
there's October Books in Southampton, which not long ago moved down the street and got a lot of their customers to form a human chain to move the stock.
There we go. Any sense of why some have survived? Is there anything, lessons learned from them?
Well, again, I think the other way round of knowing why shops folded, it gives us some ideas in some cases, and that's but how others overcame some of those same difficulties. So some of the things, small undercapitalized shops with facing huge big increase in rent, or the failure, the end of the net book agreement. We think a lot goes that there was a very broad range of titles that were available in radical bookshops, which weren't available elsewhere in the 1970s and 80s. But thanks to more being published in the UK, I mean, taking feminist book selling, and there may be people on the call who can comment more about this, but there weren't feminist books on sale in the UK, published in the UK, let alone sold in the mainstream shops. We had to import them. Thankfully, feminist publishers grew, and then those books got into mainstream shops, which was a good thing, but it did mean that quite a bit of the sales that of some of these radical shops, same with a lot of the gay literature, that there was a change there. So some of it was the good thing that some of these, and organic gardening and vegetarianism, and there were a lot of things that had helped these shops because they were the only suppliers of the material, that thankfully became available more widely. But then on practical matters, who owned say News from Nowhere, and I think House, if you've got either you own your premises or you had a sympathetic landlord, that made a huge difference. Consistency of who was involved. As John said, some people sort of ran out of steam and didn't have people to hand it on to, especially as it become harder work. So it's something that could be usefully investigated further, but those are some of our thoughts.
Yes, the owning the premises is obviously an important factor. October Books, I've just mentioned, the reason they moved down the street was they did a community fundraising and bought the old NatWest building in 2018 and moved in. And that helps a lot if you own your own building.
There's one other point, that a lot of the surviving shops, Houseman's, Bookmarks, the Tower Hamlets shop, based in London, Bookmarks had its party links to the SWP, so that obviously helped. And the black bookshops lasted quite a while, but they eventually folded. But having a base in a national base in London, basically, that was a factor.
Thanks. And owning your own shop is one I hear a lot from all over the place. Gail, you've got a question?
Well, yeah, it's more that I just wanted to add to the extremely interesting things that everybody's already been saying. Yeah, I know the first thing was basically, I think, I don't know how much you've focused on Edinburgh so far, but there's a whole interlocking network of factors that answer, or don't answer, but supply some comments on a lot of the points that you've just been raising. I mean, for example, there was a very big radical bookshop in Edinburgh. Oh my God, whose name had escapes me right this second. 1st of May.
1st of May.
It was 1st of May, yes. And basically, they went bust. I mean, there is slightly different opinions about this, but they went bust in 1984, or maybe shortly afterwards, because a bookshop opened in Edinburgh, a feminist bookshop, and 1st of May was relying on feminist books to be a substantial part of their sales. Now, the interesting thing about that is that those premises then got passed on to an intermediate radical bookshop, again, whose name I'm sorry I can't remember, and then that in turn passed on to Lighthouse bookshop, which I think it's still in the same premises. So there's a kind of genealogy of these and interlocking results for these bookshops, and yeah, so that was, and of course Lavender Menace, that was if not the first, was amongst the first of gay and lesbian shops, and I'm sad that Sigrid isn't here today to be able to add information, because they've recently revivified themselves, having been shut for a long time, and they've got an archive and they're very active in Edinburgh again these days. Yeah. Oh, and I just wanted to also pay tribute to New Beacon Books, which is a radical black bookshop in London, which is still going and was very likely to go down the tube again a year or two ago, and they had a big crowdfunding operation. So those were just my few little bits to add in at this point.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gail. I think Andrew Thacker wanted to raise something.
Yeah, many thanks to the three people for the really fascinating talk, and I just wanted to see if you could say anything more about that moment. I think John, you mentioned it about the importance of a kind of university customer base to the radical bookshops. If you could add any more information. I mean, you mentioned October books, and I was a student at Southampton in the late 80s, and I remember that the English department then would send their reading lists for the first years and the second and third years to October books and say to the students, you can get your books from October books. So there was a quite specific kind of synergy there. So I just wonder if there's any other information, even if you could get any kind of estimate of kind of how important that was for certain bookshops. I know Wedge had links, Warwick was there, and the Lanch, and
the Lanch, yes,
the Lanch, yeah, was there. So that was just, yeah, any more information about that kind of side.
Well, we haven't, I don't think we've systematically investigated that, but it's something we can and probably should do. And I also, part of the decline was some universities, certainly in Coventry, the university owned its own bookshop and told its lecturers to send their students there and not to us. I think that was a commercial rather than a political attack, but who knows? Maybe it was both. Yeah, I'm sure there's if you mapped the universities and polys and radical bookshops, I think you would find quite a what's the word, correlation.
Presumably more so outside of London, wouldn't it? I mean, you were talking about university cities outside of London, because I suspect the London that correlation in London probably wouldn't work quite as strongly, would it? I mean, I don't know, maybe Sam might have a better sense of how that works.
Was there a university town that didn't have a radical bookshop?
Yeah, look at it that way.
Good question.
Can't think of any.
No, I mean, thinking of grassroots, I think it was very variable. We during the period, which say 76 to 82, when I was there, there were lecturers who were recommending set texts, which were books that we would have happily were stocking anyway. So in the sociology, critical social policy, those sorts of areas. But I do remember that we also tied up with for a few years and a law lecturer sent people down, and we had these, books on tort or whatever it was, which of course were very usefully expensive, and it would have made a difference. But it didn't, it wasn't something you could rely on year after year, because it was very dependent on individuals.
And I think they were what was called non-net books, which I don't think exist anymore. Does that ring a bell with anybody?
At Liverpool, we had Tony Lane at the university, and he told us what the recommended books were. And I used to go up with big suitcases carrying the, dozens of copies of the text. And it's such a brilliant bit of business, because you just return them straight away if we've got someone sold copies. But I know October Books had a very important business with the university.
I don't know whether it's also worth coming in at this point talking a little bit about support from libraries, because we came up with something financially. I think it improved turnover maybe more, than profitability. The textbooks helped with profitability as well. As John said, they were, they were good value books with a good margin. But one of the things we set up at Grassroots Books was that we stocked lots and lots of small pamphlets, and at that time people's rights were an important aspect. So it wasn't only sort of political things. It was, in one sense, it was, there were how to get an injunction if you're what was called then a battered wife, how to claim your social security benefits, what to do if you're homeless, how to challenge a section under Mental Health Acts that from the Mental Patients Union. There were all sorts of publications with that sort of advice, which of course was only available word of mouth or in print. You couldn't Google your rights then. And we had quite a substantial stock of that. And at the same time, community librarians, I think they called themselves, were setting up sections in their libraries to get this material out to the public. And we in Manchester established what I think became, after I left, became a national listing. So we would list all these publications, send these lists. I mean, all this is quite hard work, duplicating the list and physically sending them out to people, but would get it helped all around, in a sense, helped the libraries get the things that were very hard to get hold of. It helped the people who, let's say, the Mental Patients Union, whoever it was, who had put their information down on paper into a pamphlet, to get it out. And that became, and we also had to set up a system of sending samples to the libraries so they could look at things and then order them. And that's something, as everybody will know, that independence of a library ordering its own stock is very different now. But at the time, that was a very useful partnership.
Thank you. Sam?
Just a reflection, really, just listening to Andrew's question and the response, and then thinking, I wonder if there's some mileage in doing some research as well on tracking what's been happening here in the last few years, because a few years ago I was part of a project where we celebrated academic bookshops. We had Academic Book Week, but that was 2015 to 17. We're only less than 10 years down the line from that, and the amount of campus bookshops that have now disappeared. And I'm just wondering what impact that has, to be able to look back at the impact those Radical Bookshops had on young, university students of the time and where they are now, and now looking at what we're left with in terms of is another way of measuring. Perhaps I don't know how we would do that, but you can compare that, why bookshops are important to have around these kinds of places. But we've lost that. We have lost the campus bookshop, just doesn't really exist anymore. So it's sort of a reflexive point to make. And yes, I used to get in very big trouble for ordering non-net books when I worked at Hammocks because they just no money whatsoever, and often took the most time in a pre-computer age to find, because you would have to often ring up publishers and get them. So yeah, I do remember trying to order a Thai English dictionary for somebody at one point, and my manager getting very upset with me and saying that it cost us more money than it actually brought into the bookshop. So yeah, I do remember those days. Thanks, Emma.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Do we have other questions, queries, reflections? I have one practical one. If I'm developing future research, collecting oral narratives, archives and stuff, where should an academic be focusing? Where should they be putting their efforts at the moment? Either because it's most important or most at risk.
Could you clarify that question a bit? Sorry.
If I'm looking for developing more information about the stories about this period in bookselling in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, partly because that's when I grew up through it. And I want to target my research so I can be the most effective right now. So certain areas are at risk. Bookstores are closing, or people are moving on other places. Certain things are possibly of more interest, more useful, we should be focusing, if we're going to collect materials, archives, or oral narratives, where should we need to focus that somehow? We need to target the most useful, the most expressive, because we don't only have so many resources to put to it. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about where you think academics, researchers should be looking at the moment. What is at risk now?
Can I answer that indirectly?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've just recently submitted a scholarly article to a journal which is currently under peer review, and I'm reasonably confident it's going to be actually published. And it's about it's about the International Feminist Book Fairs, of which there were 6 around the world, well, around certain parts of the world between 1984 and 1994. Some Eleanor Careless, who's now at Newcastle, she has done some research about Feminist Book Fortnight, which arose out of these International Feminist Book Fairs. Anyway, I spent some time talking to Eleanor about sources of research and archives, and basically the conclusion that she and I came to is that the main archive, at least in this country, are the 7 or 8 folders which are this much in my filing cabinet, right? And I know that at the time there was and I have that from, I have uncovered a few other some other archive material online, actually, via online, that the organisers were actually building up an archive, but this has now disappeared. And this is something, because basically most of my research focuses on the radical book trade and the feminist book trade, and I don't know, it's actually very hard to find this stuff. I think, this is one of the things that I think this group, the Radical Book Trade History, has done brilliantly is bringing together and collecting oral histories. But the thing is, you have to have the people still alive to do the oral histories. And as John was saying, you know, we've lost Rick in the last couple of weeks, and other people have died. So I'm kind of trying to go back earlier as well, and I have done a bit. I'm sorry, I'm kind of not really answering your question. I don't know is the answer. I mean, I have days, actually, if I'm completely honest, in this circle, I have days of going, what's the point of me doing this research anyway? Who cares? You know, what use is it really to anybody? I mean, I think some of the most recent stuff is probably the most useful. But I think older stuff, I mean, my dates go back to 1898, and I'm very supportive of Dave and his ambitions to go back to 1780, you know. But is it just, you know, is it just my personal shtick, you know, or really is it going to be useful to anybody much, you know? Anyway, that's just my little
can I just back up what Gail says? I'm assuming it is worth doing. Is exactly the 70s is to focus on, because people are dying. Richard Handyside died 2 weeks ago. Tony Bunyan died about whatever it was a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
The witnesses and the people who had agency in that period, we're losing them, and we need to capture them and their attic full of stuff before it gets skipped. I'd say that's a priority, a very practical way of looking at it.
Yeah, and actually, if I can put in a tiny plug, which kind of goes on from what John was just saying, is that one of the projects that I'm very involved in at the moment is an organisation called HOWL, History of Women's Liberation, and one of the other members of the organising group is Sue O'Sullivan, who used to work at Sheba and Spare Rib, and I suppose it's kind of therefore not a coincidence that we are kind of tending to, well, we're not certainly not focusing, but the people who are coming to us are a bit, you know, feminist publishing and so on. And we're actually, I mean, we're desperate, by the way, folk, to move out of London as well with collecting our materials. So again, I'll put, I think you'd all find it interesting to have a look at. I'll put a link to the HOWL project in the chat, and then you can see what you think about it.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Right, I think that takes us to, we're running out of time. So I wanted to thank Maggie, Dave, and John for a really illuminating, really interesting talk. It is great to see all this stuff going on. As academics, we can often miss out on all the great work that people are actually doing out there. And you guys, your website is fantastic. Everybody here, if you haven't been to their website, visit it as soon as you can. Right after this meeting, there's so much material there. I really enjoyed that. So thank you very much. And I think our next session is in December.
Right. And just to say, Eben, please put yourselves on our mailing lists, and also send researchers of all ages and stages in their academic career in our direction. We're very keen to support and collaborate with serious researchers, academic researchers who've got the time and the energy and everything to delve into this topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm a bit slow. Could you just not cut everybody off until I found the website? I've got it, but I haven't been able to paste it in yet. I'll be 1 second.
Okay.